It wasn't the rain soaking her cashmere coat that chilled Eleanor to the bone. It was the absolute, deafening silence that followed the scream. "Get out of here, you old parasite. You're sucking us dry." These words weren't spoken by a faceless landlord or a hostile stranger. They belonged to Sarah, her daughter, her only child. The little person whose skin knees she washed and bandaged with cartoon bandages, whose fears of monsters under the bed she patiently soothed night after night, whose mind-boggling college education she paid for by working grueling double shifts at an accounting firm. The daughter whose fairy tale wedding she paid for by remortgaging this very house, a decision made without hesitation because her child's happiness was her own. At 67, she was by no means a fragile woman. Life had etched on her face the marks of resilience, not defeat. She held herself with the dignity and upright posture of someone who had overcome widowhood. But tonight, looking at the two sturdy suitcases that held her entire discarded life, she felt a deep, terrifying emptiness, as if her very essence had been pulled out and dumped on the wet lawn next to the luggage. Through the distorting, slanted glass of the window, she saw their silhouettes moving in the warm, golden light of the living room. Sarah, her face flushed and frozen with artistic righteousness. And Mark, her brother-in-law, the architect of this upheaval. His posture was a model of calculated avoidance, his gaze fixed on everything but the window and the woman he had just left homeless. This was Mark's game. Sarah was merely a weapon he had honed and aimed. It all began so innocently, just 2 years ago. They arrived with tears in their eyes and professionally printed spreadsheets, a gesture of filial concern. Mark was opening his own exclusive investment advisory firm, Quantum Horizon Investments. The name was so grand it seemed weightless. "They wanted to move to help you, Mom. Now that you're alone in this big old house." It made sense. The logic was impeccable, the emotional manipulation exquisite. They offered to transfer the property title to her. "For estate planning," Mark said, his voice soft as silk. "To protect the asset from possible future nursing home expenses. We'll, of course, put it in a trust." It's a sensible decision. Eleanor, alone in the echoing silence left by George's death, trusting beyond measure and perhaps too desperate to keep the family secret, signed the papers. She hadn't bothered to show them to her lawyer. What a ridiculous idea. Why would she need legal protection from her own flesh and blood? The betrayal wasn't just financial. It felt like a cellular betrayal, a deep genetic one. It felt as if her own DNA had turned against her. Parasite.
She.
The woman who, until last month, was still paying her gas and electric bills directly from her meager pension because, as Sarah explained with a sigh, "Mom, Mark's short on money in this neighborhood. He's got so much money tied up in deals." She shoved her gloved fingers, numb from the cold, into the pocket of her soaked coat. They encountered a small, cold metal object. It wasn't the house key. Sarah, in a final act of theatrical dominance, had demanded it back 10 minutes ago, her palm impatiently outstretched. It was a different key. Smaller. More elegant. An artifact from a forgotten era of the house's history. A dark, unfamiliar smile touched the corners of Eleanor's lips. Cold, sharp, like a shard of ice on the shattered remains of her face. In their mad rush to demonstrate their new power, in their mad rush to rid themselves of her and begin the destructive renovations they'd been loudly planning for weeks before her eyes, they'd forgotten one crucial, unforgivable thing. They hadn't checked the space beneath the basement floorboards. With a resolve that surprised even herself, Eleanor grasped the handles of her suitcases. She didn't look back at the brightly lit windows of the house on Maple Avenue. It was no longer hers. She walked, each step deliberate, to the curb and used her phone to summon an Uber. Her hands, she noted with detached curiosity, were remarkably steady as she tapped the screen. This was the shocking development. The expulsion. The violent severing of a bond she had believed unbreakable. But as the crimson taillights of the Uber dissolved into the sleeting darkness, the narrative shifted. The shouting and the tears were over. The storm of emotion had passed. Now began the measured, quiet phase. The long game. Eleanor directed the driver not to a hotel, where her dwindling savings would hemorrhage away, but to the south side. It was the part of the city Mark wouldn't drive through even with the car doors locked, the part he referred to with a sneer as the Forgotten Borough. She checked into a place called the Starlight Motel, a low-slung building with a flickering neon sign, where the weekly rate was payable in cash, and the man behind the bulletproof glass didn't so much as blink when a woman in a Burberry coat checked in alone. For 3 days, she did nothing. She sat in the room's single, hard-backed chair by the window, watching the rain streak the dirty glass. She processed the grief, letting it wash through her in waves. Grieving the loss of her house was a pale, secondary ache. The primary, searing pain was the grief for the daughter she thought she had raised. The Sarah who called her a parasite was an alien creature, a changeling sculpted by entitlement and wedded to an insatiable greed. On the third night, the grief finally subsided, leaving behind something cold, hard, and immaculately clear. On the fourth day, the measured narrative began in earnest. Eleanor took a city bus to the Central Library, a cavernous, dusty building she hadn't entered in years. She needed a computer that couldn't be traced back to her, a portal to a world where she could become a ghost. Her life's work hadn't been glamorous. She wasn't just a secretary. For 40 years, she was the head bookkeeper for Abernathy and Sons, a mid-sized logistics firm run by men who value discretion and precision above all else. She knew numbers. She knew their secret language. She knew how they could be made to dance, to hide, and to lie with devastating conviction. And more importantly, she knew, with an almost psychic certainty, how to spot when someone else was making them lie. Her research began. Mark's firm, Quantum Horizon Investments. Such a flashy, meaningless name, designed to dazzle the naive. He always bragged at family dinners about his high-yield returns, the impossibly savvy moves he was making in obscure emerging markets. Yet he needed his mother-in-law to cover the utility bill. The fundamental math of his life was a fraud. It takes a parasite to know a parasite. Weeks bled into a month. The measured narrative continued, smooth and deceptively calm on the surface, while powerful currents churned beneath. Eleanor moved out of the motel and found a small studio apartment in a converted textile warehouse. It was Spartan, but clean, cheap, and utterly anonymous. She furnished it piece by piece from thrift stores, creating a space that held no memories. To any observer, she was just another sad, discarded grandmother, making the best of a cruel situation, a figure of pity. She constructed a new life, a camouflage woven from routine and invisibility. Every Tuesday and Thursday, she volunteered at a soup kitchen, her hands, once accustomed to fine china, now ladling stew into chipped bowls for men and women with haunted eyes. On Wednesdays, she took a beginner's watercolor class at the community center, painting blurry landscapes that revealed none of the sharp clarity of her purpose. She became invisible in the way only the elderly can be. People saw the sensible gray hair and the comfortable walking shoes, and their eyes slid right past her, assuming a simple story of decline and irrelevance. It was the perfect cover for a campaign of espionage. One rainy Tuesday, instead of reporting for her shift at the soup kitchen, Eleanor took 3 different buses across town to a dilapidated diner called the Rusty Spoon, a place that seemed to have been pickled in decades of grease and cigarette smoke. Sitting in the cracked vinyl of the back booth was a man who looked like he was constructed entirely of wrinkles, cynicism, and old grudges. Arthur Pendleton had been the sharpest, most feared corporate litigator in the city until a tempestuous affair with a bottle of bourbon and an even messier affair with a client's wife saw him disbarred 2 decades ago. He and Eleanor's late husband, George, had been occasional drinking buddies, 2 pragmatic men who understood the world was mostly composed of shades of gray. "Ellie," Arthur wheezed, not making any effort to stand up. A plume of cigarillo smoke escaped his lips. "You look like you just buried someone you didn't particularly like." "Something like that, Arthur." She slid into the booth, the vinyl sticking to her coat. She placed a thick manila envelope on the sticky table between them. Arthur eyed it with professional suspicion. "What's this?" You finally ready to tell me where George hid that 25-year-old McCallan he was always hiding from me? It's Mark's financials, she said, her voice flat. Or, at least, the public-facing ones, cross-referenced with some private observations I made while living under his roof. Eleanor had been quiet in that house, a ghost in her own home. But she had not been blind or deaf. She'd catalogued the hushed, frantic late-night phone calls Mark made in his study. The clipped, panicked tone he used when he talked about margin calls, covering shorts, and bridge loans. She'd seen the mail before Sarah could intercept it and hide it away, letters with return addresses in the Cayman Islands, official notices from the IRS marked urgent and immediate. While cleaning his study one day, "Don't worry about it, Mom. The cleaning lady will get it," Sarah had insisted. Too late. Eleanor had photographed a few stray documents left on his desk with her phone. Flowcharts. Lists of names. "They kicked me out, Arthur. Said it was their house. They called me a parasite." Arthur's watery blue eyes, usually filmed with weary indifference, hardened to points of steel. He picked up the envelope, weighing it in his hand. "George always said you were too good for this world, Ellie. That you had a heart of pure gold. I always told him he was underestimating you. He saw the gold, but he missed the iron core." He tapped the envelope with a nicotine-stained finger. "So, what's the endgame? You want the house back?" Eleanor looked out the grimy window at the unrelenting drizzle, painting the city in shades of gray. "No," she said softly. "I don't want the house back. It's been tainted. It's just a collection of wood and nails now. I want them to learn the definition of the word parasite. I want them to understand the horror of being a host body that suddenly, violently, rejects them." Scorched earth, Arthur nodded, a slow, appreciative smile spreading across his face. "I've always found it to be the cleanest approach. More my style. So, what's my retainer?" Eleanor slid a thick, tightly wound roll of bills across the table. Her emergency cash, painstakingly saved over years. A down payment. The rest comes when Quantum Horizon implodes. The suspense in the months that followed was not born of action sequences or high-speed chases. It was the quiet, unbearable tension of waiting. It came from Eleanor sitting alone in her studio apartment, eating buttered toast for dinner and drinking lukewarm tea, while miles away, the threads she had so carefully pulled began to silently unravel the entire tapestry of her daughter's luxurious life. She kept tabs on them through the only weak link in their fortress, her grandson Leo. Leo was 16, a creature seemingly fused to his phone, but possessed of a sharp, cynical intelligence and an acute awareness that his parents were, in his own words, grade-A jerks. He had been at a sleepover the night of Eleanor's eviction. The fight when he returned and discovered his grandmother's absence, her room already stripped bare, had apparently been of nuclear proportions. Eleanor met Leo every other Saturday at a bustling coffee shop near his school, a neutral ground filled with the noise of life. He was her unwitting spy, her only source of ground-level intelligence. She never had to ask him to be. He was a boy drowning in his parents' toxicity, desperate for a lifeline. "Mom's going crazy with the renovations, Grandma," Leo said one Saturday, picking listlessly at a cinnamon muffin. "They tore out your whole kitchen. Your rose garden is just a giant mud pit. They're putting in all this white marble everywhere. Dad says it's for resale value, but it looks like a mausoleum." Eleanor sipped her tea, the porcelain cup a small warmth in her hands, carefully masking the flinch of pain. Her roses. George had planted those for her. "And how is your father? Is his business still going so well?" Leo rolled his eyes with all the dramatic flair a teenager could muster. "He's a mess. Always stressed. Yelling at people on the phone in languages I don't think are real." A couple of really serious-looking guys in suits came by the house last week. Dad said they were prospective investors, but Mom looked like she was going to throw up. Dad made me go to my room, but I heard them yelling. Something about a full audit. Guys in suits. That was faster than she had anticipated. Arthur was earning his fee. He hadn't filed a lawsuit or done anything so clumsy as to be traced back to them. He had simply used Eleanor's meticulous notes to assemble an anonymous, comprehensive whistleblower package. He'd sent it not just to a low-level SEC intake desk, but directly to an old adversary of his, now a high-ranking enforcer in their fraud division. It wasn't just a nudge, it was a well-aimed torpedo. For a house of cards like Quantum Horizon, it was a death blow. "Grandma, I really miss you at the house. It's so quiet and weird there now. Like everyone's waiting for a bomb to go off. I miss you too, sweetheart. More than you know. But remember, everything happens in its own time." She reached across the small table and squeezed his hand, a gesture of reassurance that was also a transfer of resolve. "Leo, I need you to do something for me. It's very important and you cannot, under any circumstances, tell your parents." Leo sat up straighter, his adolescent boredom evaporating, replaced by the thrill of conspiracy. Eleanor subtly passed him the small, old, ornate key, the one that had been her secret comfort in her coat pocket that terrible rainy night. In the basement, behind the old furnace, there's a loose section of wainscoting, about ankle height. Pry it away. Behind it, you will find a floor safe. This is the key. Leo's eyes widened with a comic book awe. A floor safe? You mean like secret treasure? Something like that. But Leo, this is crucial. You cannot get caught. Your father is distracted and erratic right now. I heard them talking about finishing the basement next month, digging it out to make a home theater. The contractors can't find that safe. I need what's in it before they start. "What is in it?" he whispered, leaning forward. "My exit strategy," Eleanor said, her voice steady. "And your college fund." The disparate plot lines, meticulously laid out, were beginning to draw inexorably together. Across town, in the sterile marble mausoleum being constructed on Maple Avenue, the atmosphere was becoming fatally toxic. Eleanor knew this not only from Leo's increasingly fraught reports, but because she could feel the pressure building across the city, like a change in barometric pressure before a hurricane. Mark's business wasn't just struggling. It was a classic Ponzi scheme, wrapped in the impenetrable jargon of modern finance. He was paying off early investors with money from newer victims, a high-wire act that required a constant, terrifying influx of cash to maintain its illusion of stability. All the while, he was skimming a healthy percentage off the top to fund their lifestyle, the country club memberships, Sarah's new BMW, the Italian marble being installed by non-union labor. He needed a massive injection of cash to keep the scheme from collapsing, especially with the SEC now sniffing around his carefully cooked books. That was the real, grubby reason they had kicked Eleanor out. It was never about space or convenience. It was about equity. They needed to take out a massive home equity line of credit, HELOC, against the house. They needed it to be pristine and unencumbered for the bank appraisal. And most importantly, they needed the previous owner who held unofficial life rights to live there, a verbal promise they had conveniently forgotten, to be gone, so there were no legal complications. They thought they owned the house free and clear. The deed was in their name. The path was clear. But Eleanor was about to launch her second attack, this one aimed not at Mark's finances, but at Sarah's soul. Sarah's singular obsession was her social standing, and the glittering prize at the top of that mountain was a seat on the board of the prestigious and notoriously snobbish Maple Heights Preservation Society. Sarah had been planning to host the society's annual garden gala at the house once the renovations were complete, a lavish event designed to cement her place amongst the city's elite. Eleanor spent an entire week cloistered in the musty depths of the county archives. She wore a dust mask and spent hours scrolling through microfilm, her eyes burning from the strain. She was hunting for one specific document, a detail her history buff husband George had mentioned in passing decades ago over dinner. Something about the original owner of their property. On the fifth day, she found it. In 1922, the original owner of the Maple Avenue property, a fervent amateur botanist, had signed a restrictive historic covenant with the newly formed township. It was a bizarre and ironclad document. It protected not the house itself, which was architecturally insignificant, but the three massive, ancient oak trees in the backyard and, crucially, the specific grading of the land itself, which sat atop a branch of a historic, albeit now underground, waterway. The covenant strictly forbade any significant excavation or disruption of the root systems, like, for example, digging out a basement to increase ceiling height for a home theater, or building the expansive tiered stone patio with a fire pit that Sarah was currently having installed. Eleanor paid for certified copies. She didn't send them to Sarah. That would be a declaration of war, giving them time to try and fight it, bribe a zoning official, or bury it in litigation. Instead, she created another anonymous package. This one contained a copy of the covenant, along with a dozen crystal-clear photos she had taken from a parked car down the street, showing the construction equipment tearing up the backyard, its caterpillar treads churning the sacred ground into mud. She mailed it to the home address of Mrs. Agnes Vanderveer, the ruthless, iron-willed president of the Preservation Society, a woman known to cherish historic bylaws more than her own children. 3 days later, all construction on Maple Avenue stopped. A huge, fluorescent orange stop work order was plastered to the front door by the city. Leo's report during their next coffee meeting was breathless. "It was insane, Grandma." This really scary old lady showed up and started screaming at the foreman. Mom was crying hysterically on the phone later. Mrs. Vanderveer not only kicked her out of the society, but she's also threatening a massive lawsuit against them for desecrating a landmark property. The city is saying they might have to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars to restore the original grading of the land. It's a total disaster. Eleanor sat in her anonymous studio apartment that night and allowed herself a small, cold, satisfying smile. The first pillar of their kingdom had crumbled. The suspense was now at a fever pitch, but for Sarah and Mark, it was a silent scream. Eleanor was the serene eye of the storm she had created, perfectly still while the world she had aimed her weapons at began to rip itself apart. Mark's situation was officially critical. The Helic, the loan that was supposed to be his salvation, was now frozen indefinitely. No bank would lend a dime against a property embroiled in a high-profile legal battle with both the city and the all-powerful Historical Society. The asset he had stolen was suddenly radioactive, a liability, not a lifeline. His investors, smelling blood in the water, were calling incessantly. The SEC auditors had moved from polite inquiries to issuing subpoenas and demanding terabytes of digital data. That's when Eleanor received the voicemail. She hadn't spoken to her daughter in the 3 agonizing months since her eviction. She saw Sarah's name flash on her burner phone screen and let it go to voicemail. The message, when she played it back, was a masterpiece of desperate, gaslighting self-interest.
Mom?
Mom, it's me.
Sarah.
Look, we need to talk. Where are you? It's just, Mark is having some silly trouble at work, just a big misunderstanding, and we need you to sign something. It's just a formality, a clarification about the house transfer from a few years ago. The bank is being really difficult about it for some reason. Please call me back. Whatever else has happened, we're still family. Family. The word was acid on her tongue. Eleanor calmly deleted the voicemail without a second thought. The parasite was starving, begging the host for one last drop of blood. It was time for the final convergence, the retrieval of the Ark. She met Leo that Saturday at the coffee shop. He looked pale and had dark circles under his eyes. "It's really bad at home, Grandma. I don't think Dad is sleeping at all. Mom is just drinking white wine all day. They're fighting constantly. Last night, I heard Dad telling Mom on the phone that they might have to flee the country if that vindictive bitch at the SEC doesn't back off." "Did you get it?" Eleanor asked, her voice perfectly level, a stark contrast to the wild hammering of her heart against her ribs. Without a word, Leo reached into his backpack and pulled out a heavy, waterproof document pouch, gray with the dust of ages. "It was right where you said it would be." "I didn't mean to look, but the flap was open. It's just a bunch of old papers." Eleanor took the pouch. Her hands, for the first time in this entire ordeal, trembled just a little. "They are not just old papers, Leo. They are the truth." "Are you going to be okay?" he asked, his young voice thick with a fear he didn't fully understand. He saw the endgame approaching, even if he couldn't grasp the mechanics. Are they going to go to jail?" Eleanor looked her grandson in the eye, her gaze steady and loving. Your father made his choices, Leo. Your mother chose to stand with him instead of with me. You are not responsible for the wreckage they have caused. But you need to be prepared. Things are going to change very fast. She gave him a bank passbook. This account is in your name. I set it up for you years ago with George. Don't worry, it's not connected to any of them. It's clean. It's enough for your first 2 years of college, wherever you want to go.
Don't tell them about it.
Under any circumstances. Leo didn't speak. He just hugged her, his arms wrapped tight around her neck. You're awesome, Grandma, he whispered into her coat. You're like a ninja. I'm just a parasite, remember? She whispered back, kissing the top of his head. The edge of the seat. The heart-stopping moment before the inevitable fall. Eleanor went straight back to her apartment and opened the dusty pouch on her small kitchen table. Inside were the documents her cautious, loving husband George had placed there 25 years ago. George had never trusted Mark. The boy's got shiny shoes and shifty eyes, Ellie, he used to say, a phrase that had annoyed her at the time but now echoed with prophetic wisdom. When Eleanor had signed the house over to Sarah and Mark, she had done so out of an abundance of love and a deficit of suspicion. But George, speaking with foresight from beyond the grave, had ensured she would always have a parachute. The documents in the safe proved two damning things. First, nestled at the bottom, were bearer bonds. Old school, tangible paper bonds that were as good as cash to whoever physically held them. George had bought them quietly over the years, a secret nest egg. Their matured value today was slightly more than the current market value of the house on Maple Avenue. They had been sitting, dormant and silent, directly under the feet of the very people calling her a parasite, who were desperately starving for cash, completely oblivious to the small fortune buried in their own basement. The second document, however, was infinitely more potent. It was George's masterpiece. It was the original deed to the house. And clipped securely to it was a notarized legal document from 1998, creating a life estate. It stated, in unequivocal legal language, that regardless of who held the title deed, Eleanor and George and the survivor thereof possessed the exclusive, non-revocable right to live in the property until their deaths. When Mark had his slick lawyer draw up the transfer papers 2 years ago, they had either forgotten about this filing or gambled that Eleanor, in her grief and trust, wouldn't remember it herself. She had assumed their promises to care for her were their own version of the agreement. But George, ever the pragmatist, had registered the life estate with a county clerk's office. It was officially filed, but it was from an era before comprehensive digitization. It existed not as a data point on a server, but as a physical document sitting in a dusty archive box in the basement of the county courthouse. The pristine original in her hand was her irrefutable proof. Mark and Sarah's ownership of the house was valid, but it was completely and legally subordinate to Eleanor's right to occupy it. They could not sell it without her signed permission. They could not leverage it as collateral. And they most certainly could not evict her from it. Legally, they were the guests. They had kicked the landlord out of her own house. The convergence. The end of the measured narrative. The grand and terrible reveal. It all happened on a Thursday. Acting on the information from Arthur's source, the FBI raided the offices of Quantum Horizon Investments at 9 a.m. sharp. By 10:30 a.m., federal agents were at the house on Maple Avenue, swarming the property, seizing assets bought with the stolen funds of Mark's investors. The 2 luxury BMWs were unceremoniously towed from the driveway. Eleanor didn't need to be there to witness it. It was the lead story on the local news website by 11. Local investment guru Mark Thompson accused of $20 million Ponzi scheme. A picture of Mark, looking handsome and smug from his company website, was plastered next to flashing lights. At precisely noon, Eleanor sent a professional courier to the house. The courier was instructed to deliver a single, crisp white envelope directly into Sarah Thompson's hands. Sarah, presumably amidst the surreal chaos of federal agents tagging her marble countertops and Italian leather furniture, would tear it open. Inside, there was no gloating note. No, I told you so. No emotional outpourings. Just a single, high-quality photocopy. It was a copy of the life estate agreement, with Eleanor's elegant signature next to George's firm, confident one. A single clause was highlighted in vivid yellow, the right of occupancy for life. This right is non-revocable. At the bottom of the page, in Eleanor's neat, perfectly legible cursive, she had written just 4 words. Get out of here. She didn't write parasite. She didn't need to. The echo was deafening. The devastation was absolute. Mark was arrested and denied bail. He was deemed a significant flight risk. All their assets were frozen. The house, already a financial albatross due to the Historical Society lawsuit, was now completely worthless to them. The bank wouldn't touch it. Even if the feds eventually seized it as part of Mark's criminal case, Eleanor's legally superior life estate took precedence. Whoever bought the house at auction would be buying themselves a 67-year-old roommate whom they could never, ever evict. Sarah was comprehensively ruined. Her social standing had been vaporized in a blaze of public scandal. Her husband was a common criminal. She was homeless, broke, and had now been publicly exposed as having illegally evicted her own mother. Eleanor sat in the quiet of her studio apartment. The payback was complete. It had been measured, methodical, perfectly legal, and utterly catastrophic. She had reclaimed her life and her power not by shouting or weeping, but by quietly and expertly using the very systems they thought they had mastered. But what now? The ending was never meant to be a return to the beginning. It had to be open. It had to be mysterious. Eleanor packed her small suitcase again. Over the course of a week, she cashed the bearer bonds at 3 different banks in 3 different counties, creating a significant, untraceable pool of cash. She took a taxi to Maple Avenue one last time. It was late evening. The house was dark and silent. The garish orange stopwork sign was still taped to the front door, peeling at the corners. The half-finished patio was a muddy, debris-strewn pit in the backyard. The whole property looked like a wound. She could move back in.
Right now.
She could call a locksmith in the morning. She had every legal right. She could sit alone in her sterile marble mausoleum of a kitchen and lord her victory over the ghosts of the family she had lost. But as she stood on the curb, the exact spot where she'd stood in the driving sleet 3 months ago, she realized with startling clarity that she didn't want it. The house wasn't a home anymore. It was just a building, a crime scene filled with bitter memories. It was the past. And the defining trait of a true parasite is that it needs the past, it needs the host, to survive. Eleanor wasn't a parasite. She was free of her host. She reached into her pocket and took out the old house key, the front door key Sarah had snatched from her hand. She placed it carefully on the stone pillar by the mailbox. A final offering to a life that no longer existed. Eleanor turned and walked away from the house without a backward glance. She didn't call an Uber this time. At the far end of the quiet, tree-lined street, a sleek, dark sedan was idling, its engine a low hum in the twilight. As she approached the car, the tinted rear passenger window rolled down. Arthur Pendleton was sitting in the back, a fresh cigarillo glowing in the gloom. "Is it done?" he asked, the words carried on a plume of smoke. "It's done," Eleanor said, her voice calm as she slid into the plush leather seat beside him. "Clean," he pressed. "Immaculate. They never even saw me." Arthur gave a satisfied nod, rapping his knuckles on the partition to signal the silent driver. "George would have loved this. He always said you had ice water in your veins." He meant it as the highest compliment. He took a long drag from the cigarillo. "So, where to now, Ellie?" "Back to the studio." Eleanor leaned her head back against the soft leather, a world away from the hard plastic seats of the city bus. She felt the tension of the last few months finally unspool from her spine. "No, Arthur. Take me to the airport." She pulled a brand-new passport from her purse. "I think it's time I finally went to visit George's sister in Costa Rica. She always told me I should retire somewhere warm, somewhere nobody knows my name." As the car accelerated smoothly, turning away from the wreckage of Maple Avenue and merging with the flow of the highway, the story settled, leaving a trail of tantalizing questions in its wake. Was Costa Rica the plan all along? How much of this was improvisation, and how much was the activation of a contingency plan she and George had devised years ago? Was the cruel betrayal merely the final trigger for an escape she had been subconsciously orchestrating for years? Had George truly been the cautious, pragmatic one, or was Eleanor always the mastermind, hiding in plain sight, a quiet bookkeeper waiting patiently for the moment her host tried to cast her off, only to discover she had teeth of her own? The revenge was complete. The parasite had consumed the host, leaving an empty shell behind. But which one was which, in the end, remained deliciously, mysteriously unclear.
My grandmother told me this story. Thanks for watching this video. Bye bye!